The date is the 22nd of June, 1945. On the southern tip of Okinawa, in a cave system carved into the coral limestone of Hill 89, a 67-year-old general is writing. The air smells of gunpowder residue, wet stone, and something organic that no one in the cave acknowledges. Outside, the sound is continuous, not the discrete crack of individual artillery rounds, but a sustained, grinding pressure, as if the island itself is being compressed from above. Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima sets down his brush. He has just completed a letter to Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo. In it, he describes what he has watched the United States Marine Corps do to his army over the previous 82 days, and what he has concluded about the men who did it. He will be dead within hours. He knows this. The ritual preparations are already underway. But the letter exists, the testimony exists, and scattered across the wreckage of the Shuri Line, in post-war interrogation rooms in Tokyo and Washington, in the debriefings of the handful of officers who survived the battle in any condition to speak, a picture would gradually assemble itself. A picture of what the Japanese High Command had believed going into Okinawa, what they discovered once the fighting began, and the specific moment when at least one Japanese general understood that the theory his army had built its entire defensive doctrine around was not merely wrong, but wrong in a way that could not be corrected mid-battle. What Ushijima wrote in that cave, and what he told his surviving staff in the final hours, contradicted nearly everything the Imperial Japanese Army had formerly believed about American fighting men since the 1930s. The question that remains, the one his letter raises but does not fully answer, is exactly when he knew. Part 1. What the Japanese expected. The intellectual architecture of Japanese military doctrine in the 1930s and early 1940s was built on a specific theory of the American soldier. It was not a theory born of contempt exactly, though contempt was certainly present, but of a reading of American history, American society, and American psychology that the Imperial Japanese Army had spent decades constructing. The theory went roughly like this. The United States was a wealthy, democratic, commercially oriented nation. Its soldiers were volunteers and draftees drawn from a civilian population that valued individual life, that had no warrior tradition in the feudal sense, and that was fundamentally oriented toward comfort and survival. American soldiers would fight when conditions were favorable. When conditions became catastrophic, when casualties mounted past a certain threshold, when the tactical situation became hopeless, when the psychological cost of continuing exceeded the psychological cost of stopping, American soldiers would break. This was not entirely irrational. It drew on real observations. American forces in the Philippines in 1941 and 1942 had surrendered in large numbers. The fall of Corregidor in May 1942 had delivered roughly 11,000 American and Filipino troops into Japanese captivity in a single day. Japanese planners read this as confirmation. Push hard enough, bleed them enough, and the democratic soldier will choose life over a hopeless objective. What the theory missed, catastrophically as it turned out, was the distinction between a force that surrenders because it has been outrun and cut off, and a force that chooses not to stop. The man who understood this distinction most precisely by the end of Okinawa was Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, the commanding general of the Japanese 32nd Army. Ushijima was born in 1887 in Kagoshima Prefecture on the southernmost tip of Kyushu, the same volcanic island chain that would eventually be the staging ground for the invasion of Japan that Okinawa was designed to prevent. He was a career infantry officer, a graduate of the Imperial Japanese Army Academy, a veteran of the China campaigns. By the time he was assigned to defend Okinawa in August 1944, he had spent 4 decades studying war. He had commanded the military academy at Zama. He was regarded within the Japanese army as a man of genuine intellectual seriousness, capable of holding contradictory information in his mind without flinching from its implications. He was given an island 60 miles long and 2 to 18 miles wide. He was given roughly 100,000 men. He was given a mission that the Imperial General Headquarters did not actually believe he could accomplish, not in the sense of defeating the American invasion, but in the sense of making the invasion expensive enough to alter American political calculations about whether to invade the Japanese home islands. This was the strategy, not to win, but to bleed. To make every yard of Okinawan soil cost so much American blood that the politicians in Washington would calculate the price of Kyushu and Honshu and recoil. It was, in a cold analytical sense, a reasonable strategy, and it required Ushijima to understand his enemy in precise, unsentimental terms. The man Ushijima assigned to think about this most carefully was his chief of staff, Lieutenant General Isamu Cho, and his senior operations officer, Colonel Hiromichi Yahara. These three men, Ushijima, Cho, and Yahara, formed the command triangle of the 32nd Army, and they disagreed with each other in ways that became increasingly consequential as the battle developed. Cho was aggressive, emotional, a believer in the offensive spirit. Yahara was analytical, cold, a planner who thought in systems and probabilities. Ushijima was the man in the middle, the one who had to translate their arguments into decisions. And then there was the question of the Americans, the specific Americans who landed on Okinawa on April 1, 1945, a date the Americans called Love Day, were drawn from two sources. The Army's 24th Corps, under Major General John Hodge, would handle the southern part of the island. The 1st and 6th Marine Divisions, under Major General Roy Geiger's 3rd Amphibious Corps, would handle the north and then rotate south as the battle developed. In total, the initial landing force was roughly 60,000 men, with another 180,000 in support and reserve. Hold that number, 180,000 men in reserve, for a single island. Ushijima had 100,000 total, with no resupply coming, no reinforcement possible after the American fleet established dominance of the surrounding sea. The arithmetic was not in his favor from the first morning. But arithmetic had never been the point. The point was cost. And the men who would determine that cost, the men who would either break at some threshold of pain or refuse to, were already wading ashore while Ushijima's garrison watched from prepared positions in the hills and let them come. Part 2. The Ridges. Meet First Lieutenant James Marvin Masters, 33 years old at the time of the Okinawa campaign, born June 11, 1911, a career Marine officer from the old China Marine tradition. He had served in China before the war, in the days when American Marines garrisoned the international settlement in Shanghai and drilled in the shadow of Japanese military expansion. By April 1945, Masters was serving as a company commander with the 1st Marine Division. He would receive the Navy Cross for his actions on Okinawa. The citation, as these things go, is spare. It does not capture what the ridges actually felt like. For that, you need the terrain. Okinawa's southern third, the ground that Ushijima had chosen as his killing ground, is not jungle in the sense that most people imagine the Pacific. It is a landscape of limestone ridges, steep-sided and irregular, covered in a thin skin of soil that the spring rains turns to mud. The ridges run roughly east to west, which means that any American force moving south had to cross them perpendicular to their long axis, had to climb the face of each ridge, take fire from the crest, clear the reverse slope, and then descend into the next valley to face the next ridge. Ushijima's engineers had spent months turning those ridges into fortifications, not the simple earthworks of an earlier era, but a three-dimensional network of tunnels, bunkers, and interconnected firing positions that could be mutually supporting even after the surface had been swept clean by naval gunfire and artillery. The Americans could bombard a ridge for 48 hours, reduce its surface to cratered rubble, and then send infantry up the slope, and the Japanese defenders would emerge from their tunnels, intact, to meet them at the crest. This was the central tactical problem of Okinawa, and it was a problem that no amount of firepower could simply solve. It required men to go up the slope anyway, to close the distance, to clear the tunnels with flamethrowers and satchel charges, position by position, yard by yard. The Americans did this. They did it at Kakazu Ridge in the first week of April. where the Army's 96th Infantry Division attacked across open ground against prepared positions and took casualties that, in any previous American war, might have been described as catastrophic. The 31st Infantry Regiment lost roughly 600 men in 2 days against a single ridge. They did not break. They consolidated, called for more ammunition, and attacked again. They did it at the Shuri Line through April and into May, a fortified belt that ran across the entire width of the island, anchored on Shuri Castle itself, defended by the bulk of Ushijima's remaining strength. The fighting here was close, sustained, and grinding, in a way that defies easy summary. Flame tanks, demolition teams, hand grenades thrown from one side of a crest to the other at distances of 20 feet. Positions taken, lost, retaken, lost again, retaken. And then Sugarloaf Hill. Sugarloaf was a low hill, barely 50 feet high, that sat at the western anchor of the Shuri Line's outer defences. Its military value came not from its height, but from its position. It was mutually supporting with two adjacent hills, Half Moon and Horseshoe, in a triangular arrangement that meant any attack on one drew fire from the other two. The 6th Marine Division attacked Sugarloaf 11 times between May 12th and May 18th, 1945. 11 times. Each attack was repulsed. Each time the Marines reorganized, treated their wounded, replaced their dead with men from reserve, and attacked again. The total Marine casualties in the Sugarloaf complex over those 6 days exceeded 2,600 men, killed, wounded, and missing, against a hill 50 feet high. Hold that number too, 2,600 casualties, 6 days, 50 feet of elevation. And on May 18th, the 6th Marine Division took Sugarloaf and held it. This is what Ushijima was watching from his headquarters beneath Shuri Castle. Not American soldiers breaking under pressure. American soldiers absorbing pressure at a rate his calculations had not fully accounted for, and continuing to function as a military organization while doing so. His intelligence officers were filing reports. His forward commanders were sending back accounts of what they were seeing. And what they were seeing was not the model of the democratic soldier who chooses life over a hopeless objective. They were seeing something that required a different explanation. The Japanese after-action assessments from this period, the ones that survived, that made their way into post-war archives, contain a recurring phrase that translates roughly as, "they do not stop." Not as a compliment. As an observation that had tactical implications, the Japanese were struggling to process. An enemy who does not stop at the expected threshold changes the entire calculus of a defensive battle. Because a defensive battle, in the Japanese conception, was a battle of thresholds. You impose enough cost, you reach the threshold, the enemy stops. If the enemy does not stop, the defensive battle has no natural terminus. It simply continues until one side is destroyed. Ushijima understood this. The question was whether his superiors in Tokyo would allow him to respond to it rationally. If this investigation gives you a sharper picture of what Okinawa actually looked like from the Japanese command bunker, not the version that survived in official communiques, but the version that men were recording when they thought only history was watching, then hit the like button. It helps keep this story visible a little longer, and that matters. Part 3. The Arguments Underground. The command triangle of the 32nd Army was, by late April and early May of 1945, under severe internal stress. Lieutenant General Isamu Cho had been arguing since the early weeks of the battle for a general counter-offensive. His reasoning was that the defensive strategy, however sound in theory, was producing a slow attrition that Ushijima's force could not sustain indefinitely. Better, Cho argued, to strike before the army was bled to nothing, to throw the remaining strength of the 32nd Army at the American lines in a single massive night attack, break through, and force the battle into a different phase. The offensive spirit. The warrior's answer to a deteriorating situation. Colonel Hiromichi Yahara argued against this with everything he had. Yahara was, by any measure, one of the most analytically rigorous officers in the Japanese army. He had studied at the Army War College, had served as an exchange officer in the United States in the 1930s, and had spent those years watching American military culture at close range. He knew what American logistics looked like. He knew what American industrial capacity meant in a sustained campaign. And he had designed the 32nd Army's defensive strategy specifically around the insight that the Americans could not be beaten in a stand-up fight. That the only way to make Okinawa expensive enough to matter was to force the Americans to come to the Japanese, yard by yard, in ground that negated American firepower advantages. A general counteroffensive, Yahara argued, would throw away every advantage the defensive terrain provided. It would expose Japanese infantry to American artillery and naval gunfire in open ground, where the Americans' material superiority would be decisive. It would not break the Americans. It would simply accelerate the destruction of the 32nd Army. He was right. Ushijima knew Yahara was right, but the pressure from Tokyo was real, the pressure from Cho was real, and the morale of an army that has been absorbing punishment for weeks without striking back is a factor that a commander cannot entirely ignore. On the night of May 3, 1945, Ushijima authorized the general counteroffensive. It was a disaster. The 32nd Army attacked across a wide front, attempting to infiltrate American lines, land amphibious forces on both flanks, and create the kind of confusion that might, in a different war against a different enemy, have produced a breakthrough. The Americans responded with artillery, naval gunfire, and the kind of systematic firepower that Yahara had predicted would be decisive. By the morning of May 4th, the counteroffensive had failed completely. Japanese losses in those 2 days were catastrophic. Multiple thousands of men, experienced soldiers who could not be replaced, thrown away in exactly the kind of open ground engagement that Yahara had designed the entire defensive scheme to avoid. Ushijima, according to post-war accounts, took personal responsibility. He did not blame Cho publicly. He did not countermand the decision retroactively. He simply absorbed the result and returned to the defensive strategy with roughly a third fewer men than he had started with. Here is the thing to hold on to. After the failed counteroffensive, the Japanese command's assessments of American fighting capacity become more precise, not less. Because the counteroffensive had provided a kind of controlled experiment. The Japanese had attacked, the Americans had responded, and the Americans had responded in a way that stripped away any remaining illusion that they would break if hit hard enough. The American defensive response to the May 3rd counteroffensive was not panic. It was not disorder. It was a coordinated, systematic application of firepower that functioned exactly as designed, at 2 in the morning against multiple simultaneous attacks under pressure. Yahara recorded it. Ushijima observed the same. And this is what the only senior Japanese officer to survive Okinawa eventually told the world. Yahara survived because Ushijima ordered him to survive. In the final days of the battle, as the 32nd Army's last position on the Kian Peninsula was being compressed by American forces advancing from the north, Ushijima ordered Yahara to escape, to attempt to pass through American lines in civilian clothing, to reach Tokyo, and to deliver a personal account of what had happened on Okinawa to the Imperial General Headquarters. The reasoning was characteristically unsentimental. Yahara knew more about what the battle had actually revealed than any other officer alive. That knowledge was worth more to Japan than Yahara's death. Yahara attempted the escape. He was captured by American forces in civilian clothing on June 17, 1945. He was identified, interrogated, and held as a prisoner of war. He survived the war. He came home. He wrote a book. Part 4. The Forensic Verdict. Here is the forensic verdict of this investigation. Hiromichi Yahara's account, published in Japanese in 1972 and translated into English as The Battle for Okinawa in 1995, is one of the most precise first-person assessments of American military capacity to emerge from any Japanese source in the Second World War. It is precise not because Yahara was generous toward the Americans. He was not particularly. but because Yahara was a professional who had spent his career trying to understand military systems analytically, and what he saw on Okinawa demanded an honest accounting. What did he find? First, American logistics. Yahara was a man who had studied American industrial capacity during his exchange posting in the 1930s, and even his preparatory assessments had underestimated what he actually encountered. The volume of naval gunfire alone, the weight of shells that American destroyers, cruisers, and battleships delivered against Japanese positions on a daily basis, exceeded anything that Japanese doctrine had treated as a planning assumption. The USS Tennessee, the USS Maryland, the USS Colorado, and the other battleships of the Gunfire Support Group were not occasional assets. They were continuous. They were available on call. They were so reliably present that American infantry commanders had developed standardized procedures for requesting naval gunfire support at the company level. A company-level commander could, within a defined process, direct the guns of a battleship. Think about what that means. A captain commanding 200 men could, under the right circumstances, bring a 14-inch naval gun to bear on a specific bunker. This was not accidental. This was the product of years of combined arms development, of communications doctrine, of liaison systems built and tested in earlier Pacific campaigns. It was a system. And Yahara, who had designed a defensive scheme specifically intended to absorb American firepower and survive it, was watching that system function at a level of integration he had not fully anticipated. Second, American infantry. This is where Yahara's assessment becomes most interesting, because it contradicts the standard Japanese doctrine in the most direct way possible. Yahara wrote, and this is documented in his post-war account, that American infantry on Okinawa demonstrated a combination of qualities that Japanese doctrine had explicitly predicted they would not possess. They were aggressive under fire. They maintained unit cohesion under conditions of sustained casualties that would have, in Yahara's professional assessment, broken most armies. They adapted tactically at the small unit level with a speed and flexibility that Yahara had not expected from a conscript force. And they did not, at any point in the battle, demonstrate the threshold behavior that Japanese doctrine had predicted, the point at which casualties would exceed the psychological tolerance of democratic soldiers and produce a collapse. They did not stop. Yahara's explanation for this, and it is a careful, unsentimental explanation, centers on a distinction he draws between individual courage and systemic resilience. He does not argue that American soldiers were individually braver than Japanese soldiers. He argues something more structurally interesting, that American small unit leadership, the sergeants, the platoon commanders, the company commanders like James Masters, operated with a degree of tactical autonomy that allowed units to continue functioning even when their original plan had been destroyed by combat reality. This was, of course, a description of something the German military had formalized as Auftragstactik, mission-type tactics, the principle that subordinate commanders should be given objectives and the authority to achieve them by whatever means the situation requires, rather than specific orders that become obsolete the moment contact is made. The Americans had not invented this principle and had not formalized it in the same way the Germans had. But they had arrived at something functionally similar through a different route, through the Marine Corps' emphasis on small unit initiative, through the Army's combat experience accumulated over 3 years of Pacific fighting, through the practical necessity of operating in terrain where higher-level control was frequently impossible. Yahara saw this, he recorded it, he understood its implications. The implication was that the Japanese defensive strategy, however intelligently designed, was operating against an enemy whose tactical flexibility allowed it to find solutions to defensive problems faster than those solutions could be countered. Every time the Japanese developed a new defensive technique, a new way of using the terrain, a new method of constructing mutually supporting positions, the Americans adapted. Not at the army level, not through a slow process of doctrinal revision, but at the company and battalion level, in the field, within days. Men like James Masters embodied, in Yahara's assessment, something beyond individual heroism, though the Navy cross-citation documents that clearly enough. They represented a systemic quality, a capacity for tactical problem-solving under fire that the Japanese defensive architecture had not been designed to defeat. The third thing Yahara recorded was the hardest: American morale. Not morale in the sense of enthusiasm or patriotic fervor. Morale in the operational sense, the capacity of units to maintain cohesion and offensive capability after absorbing significant casualties. Yahara noted specifically that American units which had taken 30, 40, even 50% casualties in a single engagement continued to function as organized military forces. They evacuated their wounded, and the American casualty evacuation system was, from a Japanese perspective, extraordinary. They received replacements, they reorganized, and they attacked again. The casualty evacuation point is not a minor detail. Yahara specifically identified the American system of recovering wounded men from the battlefield as a factor in unit morale the Japanese doctrine had underweighted. A soldier who knows that if he is wounded he will be carried out, that the organization around him considers his survival worth the risk of evacuation under fire, fights differently from a soldier who understands that the wounded are, in practical terms, abandoned. This is not a moral observation, it is an operational one. Yahara made it in operational terms. He had watched American corpsmen and stretcher-bearers operate under fire for 82 days. He had watched them go forward to recover men who were still being shot at. He had watched American units halt offensive operations temporarily to ensure their wounded were evacuated before continuing. And he had concluded, as a professional military analyst, that this was not sentimentality. It was a force multiplier. Now consider the larger frame. Ushijima died on June 22, 1945. He conducted the traditional ritual of seppuku in the final cave position on the Kian Peninsula, along with Cho. The 32nd Army had, by that point, ceased to exist as a military organization. Total Japanese military dead on Okinawa reached approximately 110,000. Okinawan civilian dead, the people who had lived on this island before either army arrived, numbered somewhere between 40,000 and 150,000, a range that reflects how completely the civilian population was consumed by a battle they had no part in starting. American military dead on Okinawa, 12,427. Wounded, 36,631. These are the figures for the entire campaign. They are staggering by any measure of any previous American war, and they were not enough to break the American force. Yahara was captured 11 days before Ushijima died. He spent the remaining weeks of the war as a prisoner, watching from a distance as Japan's strategic situation collapsed. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, the Emperor's radio address announcing surrender, the end of a war that Okinawa had been designed to prevent from reaching the home islands. He lived until 1981. He was 78 years old when he died. In his book, in the final pages, Yahara returned to the question that had defined his professional life. What had Okinawa actually demonstrated? Not in the propaganda sense, not in the nationalist sense, but in the cold analytical sense of a staff officer trying to understand what had happened to his army. His answer was precise. The Americans had won not because they were individually superior soldiers, Yahara was careful about this, but because they had built a military system in which individual competence, small unit initiative, material abundance, and organizational resilience were integrated in a way that the Japanese defensive architecture could slow but could not stop. Every element reinforced every other element. Firepower supported infantry. Infantry exploited firepower. Logistics sustained both. Leadership at every level, from the company commander calling naval gunfire to the corpsman going forward under fire, operated within a framework that made the system more than the sum of its parts. He called it, in effect, a machine that learned. This is the most important assessment in the entire book, and it has received less attention than it deserves, possibly because it is inconvenient for several different national narratives simultaneously. It is inconvenient for the American narrative because it locates American success in systems rather than heroism. It is inconvenient for the Japanese narrative because it concedes, in precise professional terms, that the defensive strategy was defeated not by luck or overwhelming numbers, but by qualitative superiority in combined arms integration. And it is honest in a way that very few assessments of Okinawa, from either side, have managed to be. James Masters lived until August 5, 1988. He died at his home in Washington, D.C. He had risen to the rank of Lieutenant General in the United States Marine Corps. He had served as a China Marine before the war, fought across the Pacific, received his Navy Cross on Okinawa, and continued serving through Korea and into the Cold War era. He was 77 years old when he died. He and Yahara overlapped in history by 36 years after Okinawa ended. Two men on opposite sides of the same battle, both of them professional enough to have understood, by the end of June 1945, what they had actually been part of. Neither of them, as far as the record shows, ever met. Return to that cave beneath Shuri Castle. Ushijima is still writing. The naval gunfire is still rolling through the limestone. His chief of staff wants to attack. His operations officer wants to hold. And somewhere to the north, on a slope that has been cleared and lost and cleared again, a Marine Company commander from the China Marine tradition is solving a tactical problem that no one at higher headquarters has told him how to solve. He is solving it because the system he operates within trusts him to solve it. That trust, the systemic trust embedded in American small unit doctrine, in the Navy Cross citation language, in the casualty evacuation procedures, in the naval gunfire request protocols, is what Yahara eventually identified as the decisive factor. Not the battleships, not the numbers, the trust. Ushijima finished his letter. His army held for 82 days against the largest naval armada ever assembled in the Pacific. He bought time that ultimately could not be converted into the strategic result Tokyo needed. And the man he ordered to survive, the one professional in his command he considered too analytically valuable to die, came home and wrote it all down. They do not stop. That was the observation. That was the assessment. That was what 100,000 men and 82 days on a limestone island had taught the only senior Japanese officer to survive Okinawa about the Marines and soldiers who destroyed his army. He thought they were a machine that learned. He was not wrong. If this investigation gave you something you didn't have before, a sharper angle, a detail that didn't survive in the standard accounts, hit the like button. Subscribe if you want the next chapter. And remember, the most honest assessments of any war are almost always written by the people who lost. Ushijima's cave, the naval gunfire, the letter, and a professional soldier captured in civilian clothing 11 days before the end, carrying the most precise account of American fighting capacity that any Japanese officer ever recorded. He survived to tell it.